to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey.
Hey.
Hi. So today, joining us for our review of The Three Body Problem is writer Michael Wang.
Hi.
Hey, Mike. So, Mike, you recently published your debut collection of short stories, Further News of Defeat, which has been longlisted for the Penn Bingham Award for a debut short story collection. And many of your stories, like The Three Body Problem, deal with recent Chinese history. So can you talk to us a little bit about your collection?
Yeah, my collection is a collection of historical Chinese fiction. It ranges all the way from World War II to the Tiananmen Square massacre. Towards the end, it goes into sci-fi territory a little bit, similar to The Three Body Problem. So that's why I am really excited to talk about this novel. You can find more information at michaelxwang.com.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted you to join us here, because your work does so closely mirror some of what Liu Cixin is trying to do in his book, The Three Body Problem. So as a bit of introduction, we are starting our series on contemporary Chinese sci-fi with The Three Body Problem by Liu Cixin. Since this is a review, we won't reveal any spoilers. And if you haven't read the book yet, I'm surprised because so many people have. Do keep on listening. If you want to join our discussion, you can find our book club on Reddit by clicking on the link in the episode description. And if you would like to support us in your local bookstore, you can find our bookshop.org link, which is in our episode description as well. And with that link, you can also find Mike's book, which we will have on one of our lists. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod. Next week, we'll be having an in-depth discussion of The Three Body Problem. We hope you'll join us for that episode as well. So Sam, since this was your pick for our series, can you start us off?
Yeah. This novel, published in 2007 originally and translated into English by Ken Liu in 2014, heralded the beginning of a new globalized era for Chinese science fiction. And while Chinese sci-fi certainly predates this book by quite a bit, very little of it saw any sort of international exposure. And the genre was still overcoming the Communist Party's belief that it was a dead-end capitalist art form. The Three Body Problem was written by Liu Cixin, a computer engineer now in his 50s, and won him the Hugo Award and a bunch of other nominations. It's also the first in his Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy, which is also often referred to by the same name as this book, The Three Body Problem, and has been made into a currently postponed Chinese film adaptation, and supposedly a Netflix series is in the works for it as well. So its already widespread popularity seems only to be growing.
What is this book about? I know because I've read it, but for people who haven't.
Well, that's good because we're going to talk about it. The Three Body Problem is about nanotech researcher Wang Miao's investigation into the mysterious deaths of several prominent scientists and their connection to an odd computer game about the struggle for survival on an alien planet with a chaotic astrophysics issue. We see the events of present day as Wang is pulled deeper into the mystery, as well as events in the past during the Cultural Revolution surrounding astrophysicist Ye Wenjie that led to the present day.
So I was really skeptical when I started reading the chapter about the video game the first time, but I came around to it. Like I ended up liking it quite a bit. But when I first started reading, I was like, oh my God, it's a story. it's getting us into an immersive video game.
Yeah, I think that speaks about the stigmatization of video games in novel form, right? It still hasn't reached, I guess, the literary community yet. If you just see someone playing video games or video games being described, then you're just like, a part of your mind's like, I don't know. But yeah, I think this novel maybe begins that sort of transition into video game being portrayed in, higher literary forms. And maybe it's a precursor to video games and other novels later on.
Yeah, I think it helps that it's full body VR.
Yeah. Was it published before or after Ready Player One? Because that's another one that's pretty prominent. 2011.
Then the first novel, I think, was before Ready Player One.
Yeah, by 4 years or so. But yeah, I agree about the video game stuff. It's kind of like a dream sequence.
Mm-hmm.
This book, it's not like that because it's pretty central to what's going on, but I felt the same way. So overall, I found this really enjoyable. At times, it was very suspenseful and mysterious. There are some rough patches with lengthy and sometimes confusing, though not usually terribly so, and sometimes dry explanations. But it's very engrossing, and the theoretical concepts he's trying to get across are pretty cool. The scene work and descriptions often felt detached and matter of fact for me. Like they don't always feel like they fully mesh with the characters' actions. Many of the characters also don't feel very developed, even and especially the protagonist, Wang Miao, who seems involved mostly by coincidence and does not exhibit that much agency throughout the book. Uh, on the other hand, Ye Wenjia's history, both personal and political, are much more informative and emotional. Daxia, who is a cop, has a little character to him, but mostly just feels like a hard-boiled detective type. But even when certain sections dragged, they often paved the way for big twists and revelations, so it wasn't too hard to hang on. It's fairly well balanced in that way.
When you say that it was dragging on, was it because it was too expository, too technical?
Yes. Usually those sections that were dragging were the explanations.
Yeah. I understand why you felt that way because I think we both have similar levels of science education and probably similar levels of interest in science. But I think that those passages probably work better for a different kind of reader. I think for the person who is a scientist or really has a strong interest, there's pleasure not only in seeing what happens, but also seeing exactly how it happens.
Right. But my issue isn't so much with the fact that things have to be explained. That's expected, especially for hard sci fi. But my problem was that it was exceedingly dry in a lot of those cases. That, as we'll talk about next week when we get a little bit deeper into it, I'm sure, Leo doesn't really care too much about the fineries of creative writing. So he seems to dispense with a lot of things that make good writing good and goes for clarity and scientific tones, I guess.
I mean, it is a translated work, right? So I think that the line level translation of the book is actually pretty good, although um, reading reviews of the novel in Chinese, people actually mention that Leo's line level writing is not, up to par with literary fiction. There's not really any great flowery sentences, and sometimes his characterizations are an issue. But I think this novel is also trying to uh, blend a lot of genres, combine a lot of genres, right? It's a detective novel, along with a science fiction novel, along with a historical novel. And it's no surprise that the historical novel portion is the most well developed in terms of character, while the science fiction protagonist is, just basically there for his scientific expertise. And the detective novel portion is just the hard boiled, noirish detective.
I thought the prose was just okay. I thought it was perfunctory. It did what it needed to do. And I wonder how much the other Liu, Ken Liu, had to do with, like you said, Mike, cleaning it up. But I thought it could have still used some editing. Like the only things that really bothered me about the prose, there were moments where editor or writer or translator went out of their way to tell us, and right after this happened, this happened. And it's just that's something that I just really found annoying, because it's calling attention to like the sequence of events, which I don't think you should do as like a fiction writer. I think you want to create that magic trick or a mirage. And if you keep on saying like I think he must have said it like or written it 4 times, right after this happened, this happened. And I'm like, oh my God. Like this just totally takes me out of the book.
If plot is being given to you as then this, it's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
great.
And I just wish they just cut it out.
So if you just get rid of that clause, then it's fine.
Yeah, yeah. It just the prose is fine, but it's just kind of a general clumsiness around how the story is delivered. But I actually did really like this book through the first half or two-thirds. I thought it was fantastic. It actually really reminded me of The Crying of Lot 49 in the feeling of it, the paranoia, the secret societies, even some of the science, even though there's a lot more science here. And I skimmed some of the science here because, like you, I thought it was interesting, but when it started getting to really nitty-gritty details, I had no way of knowing, how much of it is speculative, and that's a question I always had in my mind. Like, assumed most of it was accurate, but, like, for example, the description of, Alpha Centauri, I assume that it's accurate, but I don't know enough about Alpha Centauri to know how the suns move around each other. Where I kind of felt disappointed was when there was the giant meeting with the secret society, and I'm trying not to give away what happens because there are a couple of plot twists. And then from that point on to the Panama Canal section, I it totally lost me there. I went from thinking, "Wow, this is really good," to thinking, okay, it's just plot unfolding now." And all the joy I had from the book kind of just seeped away. And one reason for that is what I really liked about the book is how it used the Cultural Revolution. And once that part of the book ended and the part I just mentioned earlier started, it just felt like we needed to get through the story and all the meaning, the extra literary meaning that comes from juxtaposing the Cultural Revolution to present day with the video games to the aliens, all of that kind of disappeared for me. So I really did like the book for the first two-thirds, maybe. And then I thought the last one-third was just okay. Like I was reading to see what would happen.
I mean, I do agree that the secret societies, at least when I read the novel the first time, I found it kind of unbelievable in a sense that the Earth would respond in that way with these type of secret societies. I did think the Panama Canal section was some of the best written parts of the book, description wise, detail wise. I think at the end of the book, when it's revealed who these aliens are, in a sense, I thought that was super cool. That was some of the best parts, the most enjoyable parts of the book to me, beyond the Cultural Revolution aspects of it. And the parallels between the Cultural Revolution and that was really good.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think the parts that really focus in on the aliens at the end was good. I thought the folding was a little bit too much because I found it hard to visualize, but I don't know how else you could do it. Like that's very cinematic. It's something I would need to see on screen, honestly, because I think in a book it's just really hard to convey, like the actual image of it.
Yeah. Well, to echo what everyone has been saying, I think, Sam, yeah, I agree with you. It's an enjoyable novel. It's mysterious, but like James said, I did feel that the final third or the final portion of the novel loses steam because the thematic interest that we get from the Cultural Revolution aspect in the beginning of the novel is kind of worn out by that point. And then we're just moving through something that actually feels more like the beginning of the second novel in the trilogy rather than the first novel. Like, I feel like the pacing was a little bit off. I feel like if there was a way to end the story after the big meeting, that would have been better, in my opinion. Different from Mike, I didn't like the Panama scene. It's just a matter of sensibility, but I did find it, in fact, quite a bit corny. Just the idea, I don't want to give away too many spoilers here, but there is a scene where they use technology to fight an enemy. And the way that they use technology just seems ridiculous. It just seems like if you asked a 14-year-old boy what would be a cool fight scene, that's probably what he would have said. Like a lot of hard sci-fi, I felt like this has a lot of interesting ideas, but not all of them were really developed as much as they could be. Specifically, there are characters who seem to have an environmental bent, like Pan Han and Mike Evans, but it's not really explained the connection between their attitude towards the environment and their attitudes towards the aliens. So I feel like the ideas were good, but they weren't explored as much as they could have been.
I think Ken Liu's decision to move the Cultural Revolution section to the first part of the book is a fantastic idea because that really gives it the literary heft that it needs. I know what you're talking about, yet with the underdeveloped environmentalist ideas, but for me, it almost doesn't matter because it's so secondary to the juxtaposition to the Cultural Revolution. Like, it's definitely there, and Mike Evans especially I thought was problematic because he just sounds like a Chinese character to me. The way he talks, well, first sounds like everyone else, but also like what he says sounds like a Chinese person, does not sound like an American person
Yeah, I agree.
or Canadian. I guess English speaker with an American accent is how he's described.
Well, for someone who's holding an important role, well, somewhat important role in the novel, he barely shows up, and he is not really, developed in any meaningful kind of way besides just being an environmentalist. That's basically all he is. Um,
Well, and he provides one very important function in the book, which is um, I mean, I didn't like it because he just served to get the plot going, right? Kind of problematic. You mentioned this earlier, Sam, about the characters. I didn't have a lot of issues with some of the characters being thinly drawn. Even Wang Miao, I didn't have an issue with him being thinly drawn because he is that kind of the new person, stranger in a strange land kind of situation where he gets pulled in and his motivations don't matter that much. Like, I have no problems with him being passive because he's just kind of getting pulled through anyway. He has no power in this situation. But I did not like Mike Evans and I did not like the detective, especially the detective being as clever as he is.
Yeah,
The-
a little too perfect.
Yeah, yeah. I have to really struggle here to not spoil the book, but there's a section where all these geniuses couldn't figure it out, but he did, and I think that happened twice maybe. And I'm just like, oh, I just totally don't believe this at all.
well, that's just from his decades in the force. He has a hard eye for detail.
Yeah, his decades in the force dealing with criminals, petty criminals, trained him for this exact situation. It feels like a B movie, like something like the Fast and Furious, where you just have the guy with a perfect skill set who happened to drop in, and yeah, he's the one who can solve it. It's very like lowly common Chinese person shows up the expertise that a foreigner has. And like I get that feeling from
Yes.
the section. And I just don't believe it. Like it's this undercurrent in a lot of Chinese media. And I know this, of course, because having lived in China for quite a while, along with Yet and Sam, like there's this undercurrent where not only is it a commoner, but it's a commoner showing up like an expert, but it's also like a Chinese person showing up a foreigner. Like it's all that melded together in his character, which is not always realistic, first of all, but also very tropey.
You mentioned the Cultural Revolution at the beginning. Ken Liu decided to move that to the beginning for context and for, I guess, storytelling purposes, because originally it was buried in the middle. The writer, other Liu Cixin, he put that in the middle because he was worried the publishers wouldn't be able to get it past censors if it was right at the beginning. Apparently, he agreed with Ken Liu.
And I actually thought that was some of the best writing in the book. I wonder if it's because it's so dramatic and so much of the other book, it is dramatic, but it's also dry. This Cultural Revolution is really dramatic because it deals with the very personal and it feels like a lived experience. That story is being conveyed to us. And I found it really moving as well. But what I enjoyed about it on an idea level is it seems to smash that Cultural Revolution up against the video game, first of all, but also the conspiracy, and this feeling of paranoia kind of suffuses the whole first part of the book. And especially when there's the countdown, which I really enjoyed as well, like all of that work together. There's this feeling, just like in the Cultural Revolution, of like, I might be next, or some unknown force is going to get me. And that's, I think, the driving force for me in the first part of the book that I really enjoyed. Is it's such a surprising mashup between the Cultural Revolution and the video game and this conspiracy, like all of that works really well together for me.
I think what this novel, at least for me, like the freshness in terms of the science fiction novel, is the mesh up between Cultural Revolution, communism, and aliens, right? Otherworldly life. That's something that I haven't really thought about because before, when I've read previous science fiction stuff, it's always this Western kind of concept of first encounter. But this, it's kind of like what would first encounter be like on the other side of the world on a kind of communist level. And I think for many people, that's just never thought about.
James, you mentioned the countdown and the paranoia surrounding that. That was one of my favorite aspects of the book. That's where the mystery really started to be interesting to me, and that's pretty early in the book. And I was sad when that sense of unease kind of dissipated after that. There's still some unease throughout, but that was one of the most suspenseful parts for me. And that suspense didn't really last too long.
You didn't read the last book we read, Mike, but I thought this book did a lot of what I wanted Bacigalupi to do in the last book. Just with the Cultural Revolution, that's all I wanted from Bacigalupi, because my main critique of the last book, The Wind-Up Girl, my main critique was that he didn't fuse the history, the landscape, with the ideas of the book.
Yeah, as we talked about, like why Thailand?
Yeah. And this answers that question perfectly because in this book, obviously, there's a reason why it's set in China, not only because he's a Chinese writer, but it's obvious. Like, the history is so relevant to this book. It's relevant to the characters and how the plot unfolds, all of that. I did not get that from the last book. This is exactly what I wanted.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's possible for a non-Chinese person to write this kind of book because you need to have that lived experience to really make it work.
Or, in the case of the author of Three Body Problem, it's more like the stories that he's heard, right? Because he didn't really suffer that much from the Cultural Revolution, except he was probably a kid back then, and he was probably seeing all that stuff on the streets. So, in a sense, he did live through it, even though he didn't experience the suffering.
He does have an interesting background, though. He got moved around a bit because of the Cultural Revolution. I was reading about his family's history, and his dad and uncle, when the Civil War broke out, his family didn't really have a big stake in either side. So the writer's grandfather, with his blessing, his two sons took opposite sides and joined the opposite armies. And his father is the one, obviously, that stayed with the Communist Party. And after things settled, no one knew what happened to his uncle. He just disappeared. So who knows if he died or if he survived and went to Taiwan or what.
Yeah, that kind of stuff is super common back during the period of the Communist Revolution. In fact, there would be villages where inside the village's home, they would actually keep 3 sets of flags. They would keep a Japanese flag in case the Japanese ever came back. They would put that flag up. They would keep a communist flag, a communist star. If the communists came one day, they would put that flag up. And if the nationalists came, they would put that flag up. So that type of like back and forth is really, really common. And even if a communist army fought a nationalist army and then the communist army won, they would just take in a lot of the nationalist army, and then anyone who wanted to join could join the communist army relatively easily.
It's very Monty Python. Another weak point in the book for me was there's a section where Ye Wenjie meets her father's killers. And I thought that was kind of like, the way they talk, I found it kind of unbelievable.
Melodramatic, too.
Yeah, like, it's not the fact that they met, it's what they said. The way they spoke was just strange. They were speaking like a chorus, which I am okay with, but it's like what they said. It's just very strange. Like, they refer to a movie, and it's almost like it's asking you not to believe them because they kept on saying, it's just like that movie, which I didn't watch. So maybe for a Chinese audience, it's more believable.
I mean, what they said was surprising, and I found it believable. But given what they said, I wondered, why did they show up at all? That was my issue with it. If they were going to say what they were going to say, why even agree to come? Like, why show up?
It makes me question, like, does that section even need to be in the book? Because I'd say no. Like, I don't think it changes anything for me.
No, it felt a lot like he's playing devil's advocate in this book quite a bit. And most of the time it works, but that seemed like he felt like he had to put that in and make
Yes.
excuses for that period.
I think it has to be there because he has to participate in this balancing act that every public person in China has to, where you can talk about it in a certain way, but you can't say everything. And when you've said something, you have to backpedal a little bit. So it didn't feel as authentic as Ye Wenjie's story, but I understand why it's there. And to an extent, I can forgive it. I think that well, I don't know his personal beliefs on any of this. I do think it's a politicized issue, and I think it's substantial that we can get through this novel and there's still a sense of ambivalence. We don't have any moralizing, we don't have any sermon or anything like that. It's very difficult to pin down exactly how he feels about this.
And there was another section, I don't know if you guys felt the same. This could be my personal perversion, but I thought there was going to be a lesbian scene. Did you feel that in that scene in the hut? And I was like, is this where this is going? Like, I was really thinking,
Oh, yeah. It's a little bit late in the novel. It's probably spoilery, but I thought that was another pretty corny part of the novel. Just the reversal of her whole anti human point of view, just by seeing this woman in a hut smoking a copper pipe.
how's it described? Her ample milk-laden breasts? And I was like, okay, it's functional at least, it's not just sexual. Let's take a break now, and when we come back, we will talk about who we would recommend this book to. Welcome back. So who would you recommend this book to?
I would recommend this to fans of hard science fiction. You have to be willing to learn how things work. It is meant, I think, definitely for people who care that it actually could work. And also just for Sinophiles in general. This is a cultural phenomenon and probably the biggest literary thing out of China this century. So I think it's definitely worth paying attention to for Sinophiles and Sino appreciators of all sorts.
Do you think it's warranted? Because it does really talk about the Cultural Revolution, and that's what I loved about it. But do you think that it really should be so important to Sinophiles, especially people who are not from China?
Well, I think it's important for the reasons we talked about before, that it stoked so much interest abroad pretty quickly. I mean, not knowing that much about Chinese science fiction, I understand why this would be the one that breaks through.
I think the novel does just a lot of work in terms of trying to appeal to as massive of an audience as possible. I mean, there is an interest in China at the moment, in China's history. This is a piece of historical fiction. Even for fans of thrillers, there are certain things just thrown in for those type of readers, like there's the countdown, there's the hard-boiled detective guy. There is, themes of environmentalism. I think beyond a lot of other books coming from China, this one really does try to do a lot of things that caters to as much audience as possible, and it's a piece of literary fiction too. It has kind of deep thematic interests. I think, most people who can read it, if you can get through some of the drier parts that we've mentioned, you'll enjoy this novel.
I think this book would have also fit really well in our last series, Posthumanism.
Yeah, there are a lot of philosophical arguments going on here. Like the theoretical concepts are, like I said earlier, pretty interesting. The basic one, the three-body problem, is really interesting, even if it's hard to wrap your mind around a little bit. It's a really curious issue.
I think those philosophical questions are going to be developed even more for the readers who want to read the second and third novels of this trilogy.
So are you guys interested in reading more, the other two books in the trilogy?
Yeah, I am.
I would read them. It's very easy reading. It's not something that I felt like was a slog to get through. Because of that, I'm able to forgive a lot of the shortcomings that I mentioned because it's so pleasant and easygoing.
Yeah, me too. Did you already read the books, Mike?
Yeah, I think the other two novels are even better than the first novel. The first novel laid the groundworks for what's going to be really explored in the next two novels. I think the second book is called The Dark Forest, and the third book is called Death's End. And the ideas explored in those novels, the philosophical questions, they go so much beyond the first novel. There were some surprising parts in the first novel, some things that were thought-provoking. Those two other novels that follows this one, they are leaps and bounds, in my opinion, better than this novel.
If you only read the first novel, is it a satisfying experience?
Well, I think so. I was satisfied because I only read the first one.
Yes, though it does end not with a cliffhanger, but with a clear lead in to the next book. But yeah, I think you could read this and be satisfied.
I think it's a satisfying book for the first book in a trilogy. I mean, if I don't want to compare any science fiction to Star Wars, but after you finish the first Star Wars, you're like, okay, that was okay. It's kind of a self-contained book, but you kind of want a lot more too.
It didn't bother me at all because, like I said, I liked the first 2/3, and I thought the last 1/3 was just like whatever, just plot filler. So my joy from this book was the first part. And if it was just a standalone, it would just be a book I enjoyed, but I found flawed. With it continuing to a second book, there's always that carrot of, oh, like maybe this will be rehabilitated. But I don't need that carrot. I was satisfied with the first half or 2/3 that I already read in this book. I came into this because this book was so hyped. I came into this with pretty high expectations, as I'm sure you guys did as well. I thought it met my expectations. I didn't expect it to be a perfect book, and it wasn't, but it was enjoyable. Did you guys feel like it met your expectations?
I'm hype averse, so anytime somebody says something's good, I automatically think it's shit. So my expectations were low and I was pleasantly surprised.
I felt similarly, I guess, and I had already heard some of the complaints before going in, so I tried to keep an open mind, but also was not surprised.
There are a lot of moments in this book that I found surprising and I guess shocking. Sorry, I'm circling back to my previous point when I'm thinking about, why I wasn't disappointed or why I enjoyed it, even though it's just the first book of a trilogy. Like the fact that people get dehydrated and then sometimes they just get used for kindling. I thought it was funny, but at the same time, like, it really reminded me of the Cultural Revolution. And like, it's those moments that I think rescues the book for me or makes the book literary. The first 2/3, I think I would almost recommend to anybody. It's just the last third when I was a little bit disappointed by the end, I guess.
I will say, though, the second and third novels of this trilogy, even though they are spectacular, I think Liu Cixin's, what he doesn't do good on, like in terms of characterization and that kind of stuff, it's like he exasperates those problems that he has in his other two novels.
Oh,
But what he excels at in this novel, he excels at even more in the next two.
Okay, let's conclude here. So before we go, Mike, do you want to tell us what you're working on now that you've got your first book published?
Yeah, I'm working on a number of projects. I actually found an agent for my novel, which is also a historical novel on the communist revolution. It's hopefully it finds a publisher, but it kind of takes place from the year 1927 all the way until the death of Chairman Mao. And it follows this family, these two soldiers who kind of meet and fall in love during the communist civil war. They have to go through the Long March. and then they abandon the kid that they have on the Long March. And then the book is kind of like them trying to find their son who was lost in the Long March. And in fact, the book is called Lost in the Long March. So that book is trying to find a home, a publisher.
And similar to the other Liu, the translator Ken Liu, you were born in China, right? And then you and your parents immigrated here when you were around the same age as Ken Liu. I think like
Yeah.
He immigrated here when he was in not his teens, but earlier than that.
Yeah, I came to the United States when I was 6, and I have some peripheral experiences with the Cultural Revolution and stuff. My grandfather, he was a math teacher. In 1949, after the communists won, one of his friends told him to register for the Nationalist Party. So that's what he did. And when the Cultural Revolution hit,
after the communists won,
or like right before the communists won, so like it's like a month before the communists won, he registered for the Nationalist Party, not knowing that his friend was actually trying to send him in the wrong direction.
Oh,
yeah. Because of that, 20 years later in the Cultural Revolution, he experienced some hardships. I mean, he was paraded down the street like 1 or 2 times, and his students kind of threw vegetables at him. And his wife, my grandmother, for a couple of weeks made fun of him, called him, little nationalist and stuff. That really poisoned their relationship. But, he was able to get through it. He had it better than a lot of other people. Yeah.
Some friend.
Yeah, it's big of you to still refer to this guy as your grandfather's friend. It sounds like more of a frenemy, or I don't know, like he was after your grandma or something. Like, it sounds like a different situation.
When I was a boy, I asked this question to my grandfather. I don't even know why I asked this question, but I asked him, what is the person you hate the most? I was like 9 years old. And then
he's like, it's you, Mike. Stop bothering me.
And then this is the thing that he told me, this person. He's like, this friend told me. And then his friend, he escaped to Taiwan. So, left my grandfather there.
He's all over the map.
But yeah.
Like, his one mission was to screw over your grandfather before he left. He was like, before I go, I got to make sure to get this guy.
Well, I mean, his party affiliation was nationalist. So I think it was, more my grandfather asking the wrong person at the wrong time. What should I do?
All right. Well, we'll have to have you on again. Hopefully you can join us for some books in the future. Thanks for coming on, Mike.
Thank you for having me. I would love to be a part of this again.
Great. And listeners, thank you for listening. If you have any qualms with our review of this book, come on Reddit and shout at us. You can find that link below. You can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod. And if you want to support us in your local bookstore and Mike, you can use our bookshop.org link, which is in our episode description as well below. We'll be back next week with an in-depth discussion of this book, The Three-Body Problem. If you're interested in joining that discussion, go ahead and find a copy of the book. It's a tad long, so you'll want to get started early on, but hey, you can always skim some of the technical aspects like I did. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.